How many of you have ever received a word from God? Wave at me if you've received a word from God. Maybe you received a word by reading the scriptures. God speaks through his word. Have you ever been reading a verse and you just casually reading along and all of a sudden it was like, bam, this verse is for you, and God speaks to you through the word. I know God has spoken to me many times through the word. My grandfather was called into ministry. One night he was laying in bed and the word Ephesians 4 came to his heart, and he wasn't very familiar with the Bible, but he opened his Bible to Ephesians 4. And he read verse 11 that God has called some apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers and evangelists. And that God spoke through that word that I've called you into ministry. So God uses the word to speak to us. How many of you have ever received a word from God in prayer where you hear a still small voice just speaking something very clear and powerful to your heart? You know, when God called me to pastor this church, I remember exactly where I was the moment that God spoke to my heart and confirmed that I was to step into pastoral ministry. And it was just a still small voice in my heart. And throughout scriptures, God used that still small voice to speak to people. Some of us have heard the voice of God through trusted friends and leaders in our lives. Maybe they'll say something, and when they do, you're like, man, God speaks to me. I have friends that when we'll talk about the kingdom of God together, like the two men on the road to Emmaus, my heart burns within me, and I know that God is speaking to me in that moment. But how many of you have ever been listening to a sermon preached by a preacher, and all of a sudden everything else that he's saying just tunes out because God zeroes in on one thing and it sinks in your heart, and you're like, that's why I came here today. God uses preachers. God uses sermons to preach, and sometimes, and many times, despite the preacher. Truthfully. Maybe it's the worst sermon they ever preached, but God has a word for you through it somehow, and he delivers it. I remember he changed my life. I was at a meeting in Texas, and someone was preaching a message in Texas. We were in the city of Houston. And while I was there, God gave me a word that shaped literally the trajectory of my life in a sermon. So God speaks to us through preachers. Thank God for preachers. Thank God for sermons that are preached. Some of the greatest preachers of history. Have you ever heard of the man Billy Graham before? When we think of Billy Graham, I'll put up one of Billy Graham's quotes. God has given us two hands. One to receive with and the other to give with. We are not cisterns made for hoarding. We are channels made for sharing. Thank God for Billy Graham. Thank God for the millions of people that made decisions to follow Christ because of Billy Graham. Have you ever heard of Mother Teresa before? Man, small, framed lady in India who was a nun, but man, God used her to shake the world. She said, I know God won't give me anything I can't handle. I just wish he didn't trust me so much. Thank God for voices like hers. One of my favorite preachers of all time is Reinhard Bonnke. Reinhard Bonnke, God used mightily, I would say possibly the greatest soul winner in human history. Over 80 million decisions for Christ in his lifetime, all throughout Africa. You cannot go to a nation in Africa and mention the name Reinhard Bonnke and them not know who you're talking about. God used him powerfully, but one of my favorite sayings of his that I heard in a message is, the one seeking the will of God is always overrun by the one doing the will of God. Some people wait forever. Just what's your will, God, what's your will? And they're run over by people who just doing what they already know God has told us to do. Thank God for voices like that. I think of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. And just a couple of hundred years ago, he founded it on the principles of holiness. But John Wesley said this, give me 100 preachers who fear nothing but sin and desire nothing but God. And I care not whether they be clergymen or laymen. They alone will shake the gates of hell and set up the kingdom of heaven upon earth. Oh, what a radical preacher he was. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German preacher who stood in Germany while Hitler was building the Nazi regime, this German pastor stood up and said, "It is wrong what you're doing." Dietrich Bonhoeffer was killed for his faith, but this is what one of the things that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said: the test of the morality of a society is what it does for its children. Think about that just for a little bit, how powerful that is. But in the 4th century, there was a man by the name of John Chrysostom. And Chrysostom means golden mouth. He was such an orator that when he spoke, people said, "Man, this guy, he's got a golden mouth." John Chrysostom. He is known for saying this: if you cannot find Christ in the beggar at the church door, you will not find him in the chalice. Meaning, don't worry about communion. If you can't find Christ in the beggar at the front door, then don't worry about finding him in the chalice. Thank God for spokespeople. Thanks God for sermons. I would have given anything to be a part of one of Jesus' sermons, the Sermon on the Mount. Can you imagine how powerful and riveting that message would have been?